Museum of Art. We're so happy to see a great crowd come out today. Our speaker and guest of honor today is Mr. Radcliffe Bailey. He is an Atlanta-based artist. Yes, cheers. He's an Atlanta-based artist, and his exhibition, Radcliffe Bailey Passages, is on view here at the Knoxville Museum of Art through November 6th, so please come and see it. Tell your friends. We have free admission. But we're very grateful to have him. He is one of the most recognized of the contemporary artists, especially in this region, but really all over. And we're very honored to have him here with us today. His work is very thought-provoking, and he has a way of tapping into that interpersonal speech inside all of us to connect us with our past, with our history, and to make it this kind of universal story that we can all relate to. And he does a very beautiful job with that. So I'm very happy to have him here, and you all probably know all of his accolades. He's in museums all over the country, including the Met, the Chicago Art Institute, the Smithsonian, the High Museum of Art, maybe one day at KMA permanently. We'd love that. You can help us out. A few people I'd like to thank tonight. Some of our sponsors for the exhibition is Emerson and the Guild of the KMA. We'd also like to thank the Jack Shaman Gallery, who co-organized the exhibition with the KMA, and which represents Radcliffe's work, and the University of Tennessee for providing American Sign Language interpreters this evening. So without further ado, wonderful. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Radcliffe Bailey, and you can take it from here.
Oh, really? Thank you. Number one, thank you for having me, but it's an honor just to be recognized as an artist, and trying to make me speak. This is one of my friends. I feel honored to actually have a show within a museum within the Southeast. It's always been a very important thing for me as an artist that has grown up in the South, just to be recognized. And I used to say it was, okay. Oh man. I used to say it was always an important thing for me. And then it was also important that my parents are still alive, that I'm able to have these situations happen. I see friends that I went to college with, and I see friends that I've grown up with, and friends who actually helped me find a correct path for my work. And yeah, thank you. I'll try to start, and I'll try not to bore you. And by the way, as I start talking, feel free if you have a question. I don't mind answering questions during the talk. That's fine, because it'll help me get along. Can you guys see the images? So this is I show this image sometimes when I do talks, because when I think about my work, I've always tried to think about it in a way in which having a conversation with my ancestors and those that are close to me, and in particular, like my grandparents. My grandmother, when I was a kid, I remember one Christmas, my grandmother, when she realized that I wanted to be an artist, my mother mentioned to her that I wanted to be an artist, and that was the direction I was going. She gave me a photo album of family members that were from the late 1800s, and they were old tintype photographs. And there were photographs that were given to me in this photo album around that time, and there were probably close to, I usually say close to 400 photographs that were in the family album. And so early on in my work, I was using these images because I felt as if I really wanted to tell the story of my family in a way. And my work is always, for me, it's always been a thing of just trying to understand who I was. And there's so much that I still am learning and trying to know. And so I was given these old photographs, and I felt obligated by my grandmother to use the images. And so what I did was I choose to use the images of family members we knew nothing about. And sometimes when you're given like an old family photo album, all the photographs in the album are not necessarily family, but they're friends of family. And so these are old photographs that were given to me. And there were some photographs that were soldiers that fought in the Civil War. And if you look at the work that's upstairs, there's a sculpture with a guy who has a hat, a Union hat, and he fought in the Civil War. And so I kind of make references to those experiences and those stories that I did not know, but were kind of, I picked up a lot of information visually by things that I would see, or growing up as a kid going to the museum and remember seeing African art in the museum, in a certain section of the museum, and I remember, scratching my head with curiosity, like, what is this and how does this relate to me? And as an art student, I went to Atlanta College of Art and studied at the Woodruff Art Center, and it was a perfect library for me because it was, number one, here you have this art center that has an orchestra, symphony, and you also have libraries, and then you have a museum that's there. And it was a perfect library for me, and I would go throughout the school library, and also like through the images and the objects that were in the museum and the shows that would happen. I was introduced to the museum by my mother because my mother's great aunt was a part, she used to go to the Barnes Foundation, and she was connected to the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, and she knew the wives, and there was a interesting history that I took for granted. I didn't really understand when my mother and my grandmother were telling me these stories, but my great aunt was my favorite aunt. I would make peanut butter jelly sandwiches for her. She was very particular about what she wanted me to do and where she wanted me to place things next to things. And she was an artist, and she traveled around a lot. And I was just in awe with her. This first image, or the second image that I'm showing, is an image of my studio. And I usually work on maybe 15 to 20 different things at one time because number one, I never knew when I was finished with a work. And so what I would do was bounce around from one painting to the next and try to bring them up to the same level as the painting that I felt good about. And so this kind of shows you a little bit of my madness. And I had to I picked 7 because it felt like a perfect number. And it was always complicated when a truck would arrive and my work was wet and it wasn't done. And so I choose the number 7 as a perfect number, and when I would think something was finished. But usually it's more like, my studio kind of reminds me of the space that's upstairs in terms of the width and the size of it. And I would work on several paintings at one time, so it feels like a perfect space. It feels like I'm having a conversation with my studio upstairs. And you can kind of see a little bit. Some of the work has photographic images, and those are some of the photographs that were given to me by my grandmother. And I felt obligated when I first finished school to work on almost every image, every photograph that my grandmother gave me. And then along the way, I started trying to create a language that was based around those experiences of family members. And often in my earlier work, you would see this kind of like mint colored green, and it almost like it looks like an institutional kind of green that we see painted on walls. And my grandfather would make these birdhouses, and he would always say that the birds will tell you when the weather changes, and people will too. And he used to work at Monticello, and he would also give tours there. And so as a kid, growing up in summers, I would go and visit him at Monticello and just, wandering around the grounds and just trying to understand the stuff that was going on. I remember there was an area where they used to make, what do you call it? No, there was plaster. What do you call it? No, not tabby, but frescoes. And so there were areas where they used lime, and so a lot of that stuff influenced me by seeing those things through my grandfather's eyes. But then my grandmother would also take me on trips as a kid, and I remember her taking me on a trip to Alabama, and I remember going to Tuskegee and going to where George Washington Carver had his lab, and I remember seeing at the time they preserved it in such a way where there were objects that were still in the lab. And so a lot of my work is kind of based around experimenting with materials as well. And you can see like the pieces in the image. There's one that's on the right and on the left where you can kind of see this kind of brown, kind of dirt kind of image, and that is Georgia clay. And so what I would mix is my mediums and create a pigment and paint over top of my paintings. But also something else I was fascinated with whenever I would go somewhere to like an ocean or go to the Atlantic, I would take a jar and have a jar of water, and I would bring that jar of water back to my studio, and I would mix it with my paint, and I was just really all about trying to create meaning behind my work. And so cross between that and then thinking about my grandfather and this kind of mint green that my grandmother allowed him to use. And I say my grandmother allowed him to use because my grandmother, he had this one room in the house in right outside Charlottesville, Virginia, a town called Palmyra, where he lived, and she allowed him to paint the room this one particular color green. And so for me, it's like a memory of my grandparents. And those kind of things I kind of take personal and I try to incorporate in my work. And like, there's a painting on the right where it's a tobacco field, and the tobacco field was a tobacco field where my grandfather actually picked tobacco. But at the same time, when I'm doing stuff like that, I try to relate to a lot of other stuff, be it like African practices and particular African deities, one in particular named Eshu, which goes by the name of Legba, and we trace it back through Nigeria, and was being more so like a guardian in the crossroads, and some of his things that would relate around him would be tobacco, rum, things that are sweet, things that are hot and spicy. And so I would use water that I would bring from different areas from the ocean and mix it with dried tobacco leaves, and I would create stains and create my own kind of pigments. And that's where I was always fascinated with like a George Washington Carver. Some of these pieces where like there's a piece that's upstairs on the first level. It's called Winter Coast, and it's made out of piano keys. And the piano keys themselves were parts of pianos that I collected from a piano shop that was around the corner from where I grew up. And I wanted to make sense with those piano keys because they were becoming discarded, all the ebony and the ivory that were on the piano keys, and I wanted to trace. And that was like my first fascination with trying to understand DNA. And I felt like I could trace DNA through music and rhythms. And so I started using the piano keys in a certain way. And that right there, that's a piece on the bottom, which is a piece I made out of piano keys, which is the shape of a piano. And I did it based around, it's called Minor Keys, and based around a musician named Sun Ra. And Sun Ra talked about outer space and planets and travel. And I was always fascinated with how deep we can go into the ocean. That was very similar to outer space. And so I started making pieces based on that. And there are some other pieces in the background where I would take the felt from the piano keys and I would dip it in the indigo. And I would take the parts of the hammers and dip it in indigo, but I would take them out and I would toss them on paper and allow them to create their own kind of marks. This is my studio, but I'm working on top of, and there's a lot of pieces that are upstairs that are on top of shipping tarps. And so I started collecting a lot of shipping tarps and sails from boats, and I would paint on top of them. And so the idea was shipping and movement of people. And so what I would do, I would paint on top of them, I would sew on top of them, and then I started creating sculptures. And the sculpture that's right there in the middle is a music stand, which was a small music stand, and I decided I wanted to make it 10 feet tall. Because I have something that I don't really talk about, but sometimes when you're a small guy, you want to make big things. And that was my fascination when I was in school, and just in general. It was just trying to figure out my height and how high I could reach. And this was a piece that I made right after I made it in New Orleans. And so after making that part in the studio, I made another piece where I took like this old kind of, appears like a cage, and I put inside of it instruments that were damaged during Katrina. And so there were like all different types of saxophones, horns inside of it. And it was also based around when Katrina happened, all the musicians started to travel, and I felt that. I really enjoyed watching them move and migrate to different places. I think that you guys probably had people come in from Louisiana and New Orleans. And in Atlanta, I just remember the musical groups starting to travel, and my friends that were artists that would move around, and it was really about lifting up the music and culture on our grounds. Some of these images kind of go back and forth between like a 15-year span. This was a piece I did on Jimi Hendrix, and it was called, what did I call it? I can't remember what I called it. Pay me no mind, so if I forget stuff. But I remember going to Houston, Texas, and doing a project in the 3rd Ward in Houston. There was a place called Project Row House, where old shotgun houses that were turned into an art center. And they talked about one particular house that Lightning Hopkins, they mentioned that he may have owned the house. And so the idea that he was a blues musician, and I was given these doors from Project Row House, so I felt like, pretty much I was a shotgun house, and, blues musicians often talk about crossroads. And Jimi Hendrix had this thing where he would put a guitar on fire. And so what you see is like a guitar burning through a shotgun door house. And on the left and right hand side of it, there are almost flickering bulbs, and they're like funerary bulbs. And then I would take wood from houses that were burnt down, and I would reconfigure them. I'm kind of jumping around from 15, 20 years up until the past 5 or 6 years. This was a piece that was commissioned by the Atlanta Falcons, Mercedes-Benz Stadium. We don't have a good football team this year. It's okay. Things happen. But so I was commissioned, and I was very fascinated with, well, sometimes these things happen and buildings are being torn down and built over top of churches, but then also, like, there's some history that exists, and within that community there's Atlanta University, where a lot of historical black colleges exist. Morris Brown, Morehouse, Clark, Atlanta University, Spelman, and Morris Brown. And so when you look at the stadium, if you guys ever go to the stadium, within that area, all those colleges exist. And what I did was collect photographs from Emory University. I was going through their archives, and I collected images from historically black colleges' football teams. And so what you see are images from that are incorporated within the work. Some of them are from Howard University versus Lincoln to Atlanta University and Morris Brown. So there's a mixture of photographs of historically black college football teams. And when I was doing it, I was really thinking of communicating with those young football players who play for these particular teams, and how they may not necessarily know that they come from a history of people playing. But in one of the photographs, one in particular on the left-hand side, the second photograph, it's hard to see, but Charles Drew, who did some early surgery, heart surgery, he was also a part of like the coaching. And so some of that, there's histories within that. This one deals with, it's a family photograph. And I mentioned something earlier about a Yoruba deity named Eshu Elegba. And so his number was number 3. And then there's candy. There's red and black candy. His colors are red and black, but there's red and black jelly beans. And there's hot peppers, and there's twisted roots. And these are a lot of symbols that are kind of connected to him. And I had the family photograph, and so I would try to create the family. A lot of family photographs have become more like, I would reuse them sometimes, and they would become more like deities within my work. And this was the piece with the piano keys that I showed earlier. And it was based on minor keys, Sun Ra, and you would see on top of the piano, you see like a solar system and planets. And Sun Ra believed that he was from Saturn. And he talked about that a lot, that he was from outer space. And so for me, when I would hear this, I didn't think it was a joke. I actually believed it, and I still believe it. And he has a certain way. And as a student, when I was in school, I just remember the things that influenced me going to jazz festivals and arts festivals and meeting different artists and musicians. And I just remember going to a concert of his, and I remember him coming on an hour late because he said that the time on the planet was wrong. And I just remember all those things, and I started incorporating that in my work. And so, there you go. And this was a piece I did a piece in Memphis at Rhodes, and I remember I had to create an installation within a couple of hours, and I give myself these kind of problems to solve. And what I did was, I said I wanted to do a piece on Charlie Parker, and so what I did was I went to a bird shop and I bought an African finch, and I put the African finch within a cage, and up under the cage, at the bottom of the cage, number 1, on the left-hand side, there's an old radio playing Charlie Parker's music on, and the bird was responding to Charlie Parker's music. And so what the bird would do is that the bird would, excuse my French, shit on the paper. And so the bird would poop on sheet music. And when I pulled the sheet music out, it would look like Jackson Pollock paintings. And so I called it, and so the works on paper were called bird shit. And it was all all dealing with all the kind of like negative stuff that he dealt with too. And so, yeah. So I like to have fun. There's a little bit of humor sometimes.
And you did that in an hour?
Yeah, I did it in a couple hours, and I had to, think quick. So my first passion before I went to art school was that I wanted to play baseball. And I always wanted to play baseball. I didn't care about art or anything, I wanted to play baseball. And so once I went to art school, I started creating work based around my experiences of growing up, playing baseball. I used to play at a place called CYO, which meant Cascade Youth Organization, which was a little league organization. And Hank Aaron, when I was a kid, we would see Hank Aaron come out to the park, because Hank Aaron, the park was named after him as well. And so I was heavily influenced by that. And so what I did was create a baseball league. And I created a baseball league, and they were called the Liberators. And so there are different, in the back there's a painting that's probably about 15 feet by 15 feet, and it's made out of military blankets and felt. And some of it deals with the slave trade route and using the baseball diamond as a map. And so it goes from, when I played baseball, I was a catcher. And so catchers, we would make all the calls. We kind of run the field. And so down south is the catcher, and east is first base, and north is second base, and west is third base. And I just kind of created this whole little imaginary world for me about baseball. And on the right-hand side, there's a wood bat. I made a bat. Like this whole thing I was mentioning earlier, I like to make things that were bigger than me. I made a bat that was about 8 feet tall. I think it was actually taller. I think it's about 10 feet tall. And I made a bat, and I gold leafed the bat, and the bat's called Cleanup. And we can kind of see it a little bit. And since I was a catcher, that was my old baseball jersey, and I turned it into more like a hunter's jacket from West Africa, where it would have like talisman. And so hunters would go hunting, and they would make these little amulets to protect them whenever they would go hunting. And so what I did was use Georgia clay over top of the jersey, and I kind of formed it almost like clay. This is a piece that I made after, like in 2006, right after I traced my DNA on my mom's side to Sierra Leone and Guinea. And so I wanted to get as close as I could. And so what I did was I went to Senegal. And when I went to Senegal, I went to a place called Gorée Island, which was the door of no return, which was where that was the last time some Africans touched their land and went over into ships. And you would look out and you would see the ocean. There's a larger piece that's upstairs that's based around that. And so what you have is a photograph and this glittery screen, and the glitter was really something that I used earlier in my work, which was based around flags from Haiti, Voodoo flags from Haiti, which would have sequins. And and it was said that the glass and the reflective quality was supposed to repel evil. And so a lot of times, and within my work, I make these references with glass in front of my work, or these kind of like altar, square-like shapes within work. And so what I did in the gallery space, I recreated the door of no return. And I created like a wall with concrete and rocks. And because when I went to Senegal, I was commissioned by a festival called National Black Arts Festival, and I took two friends of mine, and our DNAs were similar. And one of them was a choreographer named Fatima Robinson, and she's a well-known choreographer who does a lot of music videos. She would do like Michael Jackson videos, and she would choreograph a lot of that. And so when I took her there, she was introduced to different dance troupes in the region. And so after, when we got back, I made a body of work based on those experiences. And so that's her dancing. And so what she's dancing is a projection of her dancing. And while she dances, it's projected on top of a glitter screen. And when she dances, she kind of spins, and then it turns into smoke and kind of goes up into the air. You can kind of see a little bit of it. This was a project I did in Toledo at the Toledo Museum, and I made a body of work with glass because they're known for glass. And I made some lanterns where I used family member photographs, and I printed the photographs like you're printing photographs in a lab, but I use emulsions over top of glass. And I made a lantern. And inside the lantern, there's a candelabra and witch candles inside of it. And I wanted to make a lantern, and a lot of the reasons why the lantern comes up, and you'll see some of the reference in work upstairs, is my father was a railroad engineer, and he used to go back and forth between Chattanooga and Atlanta, and he worked for Southern Railway. And I'm also tracing that because on his side of the family, they were part of the Underground Railroad. And that was kind of one part of the reason why my family, I was born in New Jersey. That's why my family's from New Jersey, because they were a part of the Underground Railroad in New Jersey, escaping from the South, and ended up in Jersey trying to get to Canada. And they met some Quakers in Jersey, and they ended up settling within that, and there's a township. So a lot of my family members are up that way. So a lot of it's just kind of drawing reference to my father and my father's side of the family. This was a family photograph, but I made a body of work based on ghosts. And so what I did was take the negative, and this is kind of like, this is as close as me experimenting with new meaning. Is I took a negative, and I took the negative, and I live on like old Civil War grounds in Atlanta. And so what I did was take the negative and put it in front of my backyard, and took my iPhone and photographed it, and then printed it on top of a mirror. And so it's meant to be like a ghost. This is a piece called Western Currents, and these are other paintings that I made after that experience of going to West Africa and trying to understand DNA and that kind of stuff. And so what I did was I took a lot of African art and images that I was always influenced by whenever I go to a museum, and I put them within a boat. And it was supposed to be like this kind of boat and this kind of thing where the waters are choppy and the weather's kind of unpredictable and sunny and dark at the same time. So, I don't know. And so this is some of the first time I used piano keys within my work. And this was called Storm at Sea, and based on a Yoruba deity named Shango. Shango's attributes like thunder and lightning and causing kind of storms. And so what I did was try to make the piano keys turn into storms, and I have a ship. And the African deity, the sculpture that represents the African deity is at the very end on the right-hand side, called Storm at Sea. And so upstairs also there's a body of work where whenever I would travel and go different places, I'd always try to figure out ways to make work. And so what I would do was I began to buy sheet music whenever I would go somewhere. And I remember going to Belgium and buying sheet music. And also when I went to Belgium, I worked with the Royal Museum of Central Africa, and they would take me through their collection, and I was studying their collection. And I would look at African art that was taken from the Congo by Leopold, and I would start collaging those images of African art over top of the sheet music. And so this in particular was Elmina in Ghana. This was a slave castle in Ghana, so I would do these like gouache paintings when I would travel. And I would also use water from water that I would gather from different bodies of water. And I think the water that I used from this was from Savannah. And this is called from east to west, from south to north. And it was just dealing with the migration of my family. And it's a combination of layouts of cities, and I don't know, it's a theme. If you look at the larger work upstairs to the painting, it's very similar to this, where you would have these kind of areas that go down in directions, and it was dealing with the slave trade, but also the connections between different parts around the world, be it from Haiti to Brazil, Cuba, and Charleston, Louisiana, all those different places, and how culture kind of traveled throughout those different routes. And some of it's like, you know, throughout the triangle, Bermuda Triangle, to those storms that happen. And sometimes I kind of question like those storms and the path and the patterns, and at that time period and the directions of the ships. Yeah, I do a bunch of strange stuff too. That is, there's a beehive, and there's like a bee's nest, and I had sound, and I would use the sounds. I think back then, I remember there was a World Cup, and I think it was South Africa was playing, and they had these instruments, and they were blowing into them what they call zuza or something, and they were blowing, and they sound like bees, and so I had this recording of those sounds kind of coming through. But also, like, I'm a hip-hop music kind of person, so I like Wu-Tang Clan, and so they have this whole thing, and they talk about killer bees, and so inside of that piece that's in the middle, that's what's happening. And then this piece on the right side was based around the great mosque in Mali. And so I was always fascinated with the Dogon in Mali. And what I did was make a piece where I created almost like this kind of strange kind of gutter shape that kind of dripped down with Georgia clay. And I noticed at different times in Mali, they would redo the mosque and they were covered with clay. And so what I did was had Georgia clay dripping into a conch shell. And this is called cerebral caverns. And so I had this old medicine cabinet, and a lot of it was dealing with things that were going on. I'm fascinated with the news. I listen to all that stuff, and I try to make sense of it. And this was like, there were a lot of uprisings that were happening when I was making this piece. And so I just thought about people and directions and how they were following people. And so it's called cerebral caverns. And it's in an old medicine cabinet. And it's the same bust that you see throughout the show. And this is called Windward Coast. This is a piece that's upstairs. And with the piano keys, I kind of explained a little bit about it. But as I would make the piece, I would record the sounds of myself installing the piece while listening to John Coltrane, I Love Supreme. And so when the piano keys would hit the ground, I don't have it in this piece this time, but when the piano keys would hit the ground, it kind of created a certain kind of sound or rhythm. Or whenever I would rip the box open and drop the keys, it would almost sound like ocean waves kind of hitting across a wall. And at the back end of the piece, that sound that I recorded was coming out of that conch shell. I have a speaker that was built into the conch shell that would project that sound.
Is there a significance to the conch shell? I've seen it.
I just like, I don't know, there's something about shells that kind of relate to different deities, gods and goddesses that based around the water and based around travel in the ocean. And I always thought it was like it's like a symbol of someone's spirituality. I remember going to Cumberland Island, and there's a piece upstairs where there's a guy, there's a bust on top of it, and there's a conch shell that's in concrete. And I remember going to Cumberland Island, and I went to this former plantation, and I remember the chimneys were still existing, but the wood structures were gone. And over top of the chimney, I remember seeing a conch shell that was stuck within the concrete. And I was just, for me, it was like a trace of somebody's spirituality using kind of like symbols of shells. And you can see that within different altars and different places around the world. That was as close as I got. And this is a piece called Levitate, and it was a boat that I brought back from Senegal, and I cover it with black glitter, and it floated outside of the tarp. And it's a very simple minimal piece, and I would sew on top of the tarp different symbols and things. I was always very fascinated with quilts, and so there's always a reference. Even with the pieces upstairs, there are a lot of squares and things, and the patchwork are kind of related around quilts. This was a piece I did for a show that happens in New Orleans called Prospect, and I did it along the Mississippi, in between the Mississippi and a railroad track. And so there, I created the steel drum, and I worked with some guys along in Louisiana who would work on the oil drums. And so I created a piece called Vessel. And so when you walk into the piece, there's a stereo system built on the inside. And the sound of the stereo, the sounds that I had were a friend that I kind of told this story, and I wanted him to react to it. And he played cello over top of it. And so I had that along fused with the sounds of the ocean and trains. And it was just dealing with migration by ocean, by land. And the sounds would come outside of that conch shell. And the sun would come in different directions. And if there was a full moon, you could see different things as well. This was a piece I made in Syracuse at UMass Amherst, and there was a show based around W.B. Du Bois, and W.B. Du Bois talks about a double consciousness. And so I was doing the show about W.B. Du Bois, and he was such a serious guy, but I was trying to figure out a way to incorporate some sense of humor, so I was always fascinated with the thinker. And so I made him into the thinker in bronze, and it's called Pensive. This piece is called Lost and Found, which is like an old family photo album dipped in Georgia clay. And then I have an Egyptian falcon, and also have cicadas that are in a jar on the right-hand side. And there's a hand that holds like a little image of Saturn. So it was my fascination with Sun Ra and outer space. This piece is called Tricky. And Tricky, there's a piece that's upstairs that Tricky is kind of based around. And what you have there is an old Iraq, which was part of the old cobble roads that used to exist in the city of Atlanta. And I was thinking about the people who laid down the cobble roads and the granite and the stones, but then also was dealing with like that deity that I mentioned, Eshu, and the top hat and being a symbol, but then also being someone tricky. But it's also based around someone who had escaped from slavery. And so you have like a metal collar that was around the rock, which was really dealing with that, things that were used to keep people from escaping. But there's a reference to a blacksmith that's in Charleston named Philip Simmons. And so I liked to work in steel. When I was in school, I studied sculpture, so I worked in metal a lot. And this one is more like a cabinet. This is upstairs. This is a cabinet with different objects that were given to me by different people who were important in my growth as an artist, as a person. And so there's a bunch of different objects on the inside. I won't get into them. And then there's a bottle of rum on the table too with cigarettes. This one, the one in the middle is a large tarp that is of a railroad track running up into different directions, north, south, east, and west. And at the very top, there's a neon N, which is relating around the North Star. And so I have that, and then also at the bottom, on the bottom, the sculptural piece on the bottom is it's a piano with Sun Ra album covers that would spin around, like, what do you call them? Oris, where you would have Saturn, the moon, and all these different planets, and they would spin around. I remember seeing them when I was in science class, or I don't know. They would spin around. I was just fascinated with it, but I made a piano, a steel piano at the bottom, and they would spin around. So that's a close-up of it. And one of the planets is a steel drum. And this is a piece, I don't have a title for this piece, but it's a lantern, and I had this thing around my father and about railroad lanterns, but also had this thought about like somebody who had traveled the world. And so when I originally made the piece, there was a light on the inside, and I would put it out in my yard, and I would attract all kinds of insects because, you know, they would run to the light. And so on the inside of the piece, there were nothing but insects at the bottom. And that was a part of the piece too. I don't know, I try all kinds of stuff. This one is called Palmetto Blues, and it was based on the incident that happened with the shooting of the people in the church in Charleston. And so I took like that palm, that palmetto, and made it in steel. And what you have is railroad tracks that are running upwards. And the railroad tracks are in the color of like almost the color of blood. So it's just kind of my strange way of handling very difficult situations that happen and trying to digest it. I don't know. For the past, 7 or 8 years, I feel like I've been glued to the TV every morning with the news and hearing what's crazy, be it local news, be it world news, and sometimes I try to digest it in my work and put it out whatever way I can. Feel free if anyone has any questions, because I'm almost coming close to the end. I don't mind answering.
Do you have your work, most of this work in one museum?
Well, there's a lot of stuff upstairs, but my gallery that represents me, and then also have stuff in different collections in different places. And then, you know, I have stuff that I keep myself. This is work that I made during the pandemic, because I didn't know what in the world was going to happen. I didn't know if we were going to ever have a show again. I didn't have a clue, and so I just started making work. And I would make these pieces based around railroad tracks and steel. And, yeah. I don't know.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So looking at the body of your work, clearly it's beautiful work, and you have certainly made a deep dive into your, a projection of your collective history. I'm curious, have you embraced the fluidity of your work? And is that how you...
When you say embraced it, you mean like accept the fact that I'm going to be all across the board?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because it's in your DNA, right?
Right.
And is that why you have picked music and the interest in DNA as an inspiration for your work? And has that brought you a sense of wholeness or at times a sense of conflict?
I think it's brought me a lot of wholeness, but it was complicated. I felt like when I was a student and I was studying art, I couldn't really see myself, and I've always wanted to figure out a way to see myself and understand my makeup. And, you know, there are certain things that are just, I'd say important. It'd be important to acknowledge my grandparents, my parents, my kids, all that kind of stuff. I've always wanted to figure out a way to make it a whole thing, as it was just a part of my life. It was just my only way of understanding was through art. And so often I'm trying to do things that are, I don't know, I look for problems to solve. And sometimes I create problems to solve. And sometimes it's like, it could be as simple as these two colors don't get along, and let me try to make them work on a canvas. And it could be something simple like that, or trying to solve, you know, the nastiness of the world, to all those things. And trying to be at peace with myself with it. And I don't know. I think so.
I think that the best artist is a 2-year-old. Why, right?
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
And the moment that we stop asking why,
Right.
then the artist is dead. So
Right. Exactly. And I'm kind of like that. And I play chess with myself. And that's always been a thing for me. I don't know. I feel like it's not doing what it should do if I'm not asking questions. And I've always felt like, you know, it's something as basic as, like, let's just say somebody used to make quilts, right? They would make quilts and they function. And they would make them for those who are sick and, you know, to keep somebody warm. And I think about it like that a little bit when it comes to making work. It's like I want to make myself happy or feel good or feel comfortable. And so I make things like that. And it's complicated because it's like I'm not on an auto, like, can go in the studio and can just turn it on as easy. I have to really, like, question myself and check myself before. So
I think it's a beautiful, messy body of work.
it's a beautiful one now. You said,
Beautiful, messy body of work.
thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. You use railroad tracks a lot in your work. Is there like a recurring theme or symbol that they represent, or does it kind of depend on the piece and the context?
It depends on the piece, but a lot of it's just based on travel. And my father, because my father was a railroad engineer and his family was a part of the Underground Railroad, so part of it is like tracing that. And every once in a while, I come to it often. It's not like a piece where you do it once and that's it. It's almost like it's a part of
Who you are.
my language. That's who I am. And so it kind of comes in. If, you know, I've been thinking about my father a lot lately, so I often, you know, incorporate him in my thoughts. And he's still here, but I still have to bring him along. This was a piece I did about my daughter, and it's called OWB. And Olivia is her name, and her middle name was Wilhelmina, and her last name is Bailey, so it's called OWB. And it's one of the first pieces I made during the pandemic when I realized, like, I got to start making things. And this one's called Palmyra, and it's a rock it's upstairs, but it was a rock that was taken out of my grandparents' yard, and I built a track around it because when we were kids, we would, even though my family was in Philadelphia, New Jersey, we would always catch the Southern Crescent, which was a train, which was Southern Railway, which would go from north to south. I think it would go as far as south to New Orleans and as north to Philadelphia. And my family was in Philadelphia and Virginia. And so it's all based on those kind of experiences.
Excuse me. Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
So you mentioned about a journey, and you can help me put it all together, the journey from the desire for baseball, and then the desire to move into art. Well, my question is, as an emerging for a young artist, where do you see that progression of art school and finding yourself and that journey to have that freedom? Like, how did that evolve for you?
Well, that was, my mother was a school teacher, and my mother, she created a school outside of school for me. When my brother and I, we were young, and I just remember her taking us to museums and introducing us to different things. She would always read the paper, and she would tell us what was going on. And actually, my friend Kevin Cole is here, and he's an artist who lives in Atlanta, and I remember my mom saying, you need to check out this guy's work. And I remember going to check out his work based on my mother. And so my mother was like that kind of person. She was reading the paper every day, and she had all kinds of stuff that she would check out. There would be poetry reading. I remember going to hear Amiri Baraka, based around my mother. I remember going to see a show based around P.H. Polk and James Vanderzee, based around my mother. And she was just that kind of person. So she kind of created that school. And because of that, I felt like I was led to art. And so I don't take it for granted that when I meet like younger art students, like, you know, high school age and even younger, the information that you can kind of give to them in order to help them find their way. Because a lot of it would find it fun to travel in that route. And I enjoy it, and it is fun. It's a funny kind of life to live based on whatever you make will take care of you. It's a real strange thing. It's kind of like my studio is a church. I'm not a religious person, but the studio is a church. The studio is where I go and ask questions, and, you know, in some kind of strange way, I'm being answered back by even having the opportunity to show in a museum or to have a relationship with a gallery or somebody to have your work, which supports you. I think that's important. And then, you know, an artist growing up in the southern parts of the United States, we almost kind of taught in some strange way because we don't have many opportunities that we would go north or go west or leave the country because we are not really appreciated. And so I'm really one of, it's important to be based in the places that you were raised so that you can create grounds. And sometimes you go away and it's hard to create a living, so sometimes it's important to stay rooted in those spaces and create more opportunities. I don't know if I
I
answered.
have a question. You use a lot of sheet music, I noticed, in your art.
I can't read it.
I was going to ask, I just have to ask, do you play an instrument? Do you sing? Was
No,
that
I wish I
musical
could do
come
all
from
those things.
a family member that influenced you?
I won't create it. I won't tell you any lies.
Your friends are laughing at you.
No, they're laughing at me. No, but I have an upright bass in my studio, and it's something that I go to whenever I'm stuck.
So you do play?
And so I go play with it. I can't play it. I play with it. And then when I realize how difficult it is, it's easier for me to go back to what I do. I mean, yeah. So, no, but I love music. And I think music is the glue to a lot of artists. And we couldn't really we couldn't do one thing without the other, and I appreciate all the arts, and I feel like we all do the same thing, but we just speak a different way. We have a different dialect.
Yeah. Thank you.
I had a comment more than a question. You used the word emerge, and earlier today you were talking to the kids upstairs, and you said that you're always emerging, and I thought that was a beautiful statement. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to
One of
throw that out.
one of my friends said that, I remember I had my first show, and he was this older guy, and I'm talking about, his name is Ed Spriggs, and Ed's in his late 80s, and he was like a director of Studio Museum, and he would say, always consider yourself forever emerging, and then he said something he wrote, and I would always consider yourself forever a student of the then and now, and I always felt like that was important, to always like never really put a date on myself, never really see myself as not really a part of the conversation. And that's always been like very important for me, just to try to understand that. And I try to share that as much as I can. And so, yeah, these are some of the paintings that I made. These are pandemic paintings too. I'm sorry to call them pandemic paintings, but they were paintings that really made me think of in a different way. And some of them are inside of cabinets. One of them's upstairs that's inside of a cabinet. And then there's, you know, some of the same kind of tracks and patterns and use of like indigo. And then a lot of them I use a material called flock. And so there would be paint, and it's like this velvety kind of surfaces over top. And some of, like this one was based on John Coltrane made these drawings of music in the round, and so some of those are based on that. And like this one is based on being swept away. And so what I did was I used like a palm, and I used it to paint on top of the painting. You guys laugh at me, that's not fair. And I took a palm and I would use a palm, and I would use that as my paintbrush in a strange way. And I would paint with my feet too. It's just a combination of stuff. And sometimes there are numbers that run through it, and some of the numbers are dealing with numbers during the slave trade, or to different numbers of favorite athletes. But it was also like a fascination with playing the lottery and foreseeing the future and predicting the numbers. Because I was like, I want to know the future too. This was a piece I made I made this right before the pandemic. This was for the Istanbul Biennale. And I was invited to be a part of the Istanbul Biennale. It's a big show, international show. This was in Turkey. And it was an opportunity to be like an artist who lives in this part of the country to show internationally. And I was invited to do a piece there. And the piece I was doing was going to be in the shipping yard in Istanbul. And it was like one of the oldest shipping yards. And you can think about the history of like a Turkey or somewhere. And so what I did was I created this ship based on, and I used lumber from the shipping yard. And I kind of went back to one of my favorite influences, which was Sun Ra. And he did this performance in Istanbul where he drove around on the back of a big truck with his band, and they performed on the streets in Istanbul. And so I created this kind of ship shape with the bust. I always use those busts every once in a while, but there's a radio playing Sun Ra's music, and there were some things that I worked and composed with a friend of mine who's a jazz musician named Taurus Mantine, and that kind of stuff was playing along. And that piece is upstairs, the one on the left-hand side. I talk about that piece sometimes. It's called Mahalia, and it was based on Mahalia Jackson, singer. And I just remember as a kid going to visit my grandparents, and all my aunts and uncles would come up and visit, and they lived in a very small place. So all my aunts and uncles, we would lay down and we would sleep on the floor next to each other, and there was a sea of quilts. And I just remember seeing that sea of quilts, and my grandmother getting up on a Sunday morning and asking the question, does anybody want to go to church? And I just remember nobody moving. I remember my grandmother doing something that felt very classic. She kind of dropped the mic, and she basically went to her stereo system and put on Mahalia Jackson and walked out the room. And so that's what that's based on. And the one on the left is called Haitian Fight Song, and it was a painting that I made based on Charles Mingus, a bass player. And I like Charles Mingus' music, and he had a piece called Haitian Fight Song. If you ever Google that and listen to that, you kind of get where I'm trying to go. And so, because of Haiti and my interest and fascinated with Haiti, I was thinking about Benin and tracing things from Benin and the Congo, be it the practices that exist in Haiti. And so there's a sculpture from the Congo that's at the top of the upright. And the piece is painted with acetylene torch and smoke. And so what I would take the torch and I would let the soot drop on the paper. And there's some details. And this is called Lay Me Down. And Lay Me Down is it's the bust that I use. I have a mold of it. That's why you see it so much. And the mold I made, I was interested in a material called tabby. And tabby, you can trace it to North Africa, and you can trace it to Spain, but you can also trace it to Native Americans. And it's like that when you go along, you go throughout the Carolinas and different places, you would see concrete walkways and you would see shells in the concrete. And so I'm kind of tracing tabby. And so the bust is made out of concrete with the shells. And what they would do is they would take the shells and they would crush them down and they would burn them and use the ash, and then there's a way in which it kind of mixed together like concrete. And so a lot of structures on plantations were using those materials, and so it's a combination of that kind of thought. And there's a blanket, and I don't know, it was just trying to be subtle. And so there's a shell that I just remember seeing in front of the fireplace on the plantation where the existence of the houses. And so I wanted to make a monument because I was thinking about all the monuments that were coming down, but I was thinking about the monuments I would like to build, and it was based on those who fought in the Civil War, African American.
I did have one question.
Okay.
I've noticed that you use a lot of found objects in your art. You've actually mentioned going to antique stores to find inspiration. Do you ever have difficulty letting go of some of those pieces in your artwork and then no longer being yours? They're just going out into other places?
It was always, it was one of those things where I was always happy that someone had interest in whatever I made. And I felt like in some strange way, if something goes to a museum or a collector, somebody's preserving your objects. I had to get over that and let go. Like I think at the beginning was using my old family photographs and thinking like, oh, somebody's hanging my family photographs or something that relates to me in their house. Like how do they feel about it? How do I feel about it? And I was always happy that somebody was preserving even my own family history. So does it bother me? No, I don't have a problem with it. I'm comfortable with it. It allows me to exist another day and take care of the things I need to take care of. That's the most important thing. So no, I'm cool with it. But then there's also a lot of found objects that I find that I really like and love. But it's nice to revisit them because I'm always revisiting some work. And I feel like since I started making work and making a living probably like around 92, I probably made like 40 works a year at least. Enough that I'm crossing paths with them often. And I feel honored that someone is as a caregiver of those objects. So I had to get used to that, but yeah, I'm cool with it.
But you said that there's some works of art that you keep for yourself. What's different about those than the ones you're willing to let go of?
When you say I keep for myself, mean objects or
some
art?
of your art you keep.
I don't keep enough of my own art, I'll be honest with you. You know, I'm just trying to live. I keep things for my kids, and it's hard sometimes because they need things, and when they need things, I'm like, I'll let it go.
Good evening. As a small business owner, I had a question that always comes up, and it just relates to everything you do in life. We look at things where we're trying to get through that door, and then inside that door is another door. But the problem is that when, upcoming artists and even small business owners like myself, we get through that first door, we're just so excited to get through that first door. What advice do you give to those upcoming artists that are that basically goes through the whole door? It goes through that first door and tell them like, hey, there's another door. Don't forget about that door. Don't get so caught with this and that and what you're seeing on the wall. You got another door to get through and to keep pushing forward instead of just selling where you are.
Right. I mean, there used to be, what was that saying? They used to have a saying about Atlanta. They always say it was a city forever growing, never knowing. And I'm always like, I know that there's so much more that I'm just trying to, I don't know, it's hard. That's a good question. It's a hard to answer question. It's a question that I probably would entertain in the studio while I'm working, in the back of my mind, trying to figure out, like, when do I stop? When am I happy? I'm pretty content. Myself personally, if something happened to me tomorrow, I would feel like as if I did a lot, and I'm content. But I also feel like there's a lot more to do, and I'm so much more excited about the future. And yeah, that's a good question. I'll think about that one for a little while.
But Radcliffe, when you talk about how you went outside of that, you went national and globally. So I think that you talk about that part, that would answer a lot of this question. How you went outside of Atlanta.
Yeah, I always felt like it was important to exist where I exist and where we exist. But I felt as if it's important to come back with those experiences, and I'm always trying to challenge myself. I'm never content, no matter what. I just don't think that I'm completely happy or completely there. I feel like there's so much more there is to see. And I don't feel like I've had a chance to see it all. And that that hunger has kind of kept me kind of in that kind of space. But I understand when you say, like, you know, I've always been curious about, all right, I make art, but that's not all I do. I've always wanted to try and figure out a way to create a business, and that's complicated. It's not the easiest thing to do. But then I have to remind myself this is a business, and I'm making art, and I have to be in tune with all these things that I never thought that I would have to and have to change. Social media is a whole different thing. I never really expected to deal with, and it's something that I have to deal with, and I have to change and be willing to change and understand when there is a time when I have to change. So.
Talk about layers in your art and how that relates to layers in life, in business.
What are you talking about? These are my friends. Layers.
I have a real question.
Thank you.
Because of the size of your work, is it done mainly for museums? Because I don't know a lot of homes that could accommodate the size.
No, I'm doing it for myself.
Okay.
But you also think about those kind of spaces. I'm always interested in like grandiose spaces. I want to make things that are bigger than me. I make smaller things, but I can't compromise. It's very difficult for me to make, the smallest thing I've ever made are those things upstairs on sheet music. And I don't really but I make things, but I don't make them with the thought of them being within a confined space. I don't know if that answered your question. Kind of, sort of.
Is listening to music part of your studio practice, or is it something you do outside of the studio?
Listening to music? Yes. I listen to all kind of music. I was waiting for the train to come by because I like the sounds of trains. That's a helicopter. But yes, I listen to a lot of all kinds of music, jazz. I don't know. I like all kinds of music.
How did you discover Sun Ra?
How did I discover Sun Ra? I discovered Sun Ra probably when I was in college.
In Atlanta?
Yes, in Atlanta. And
were you at those shows at that little mill place down on Knoxville or something back in those 80s?
Yeah, I was at, there were a couple places where I remember him playing. One of them was the Atlanta Jazz Festival. Oh, yeah. Another one was, there's a place in Little Five Points that he would perform, and I just remember.
Variety Playhouse.
Variety Playhouse, yeah, I was there. And I didn't know what was going on. But I was taking it, and I was like, well, okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So for a moment, these people aren't here. It's just you and I.
Okay.
And I wanted to tell you that when you were here before, and I saw your pieces for the first time, and I saw your piano key Ocean, I went home and had quite a dream. And I wanted you to know that your art has an impact on us. And
up for the evening. Any final questions?
Have you ever had a dream as far as creating art with children and their activities and following that? Or is it like literally on a different perspective, creating art, just kind of comparing both, same versus same? You ever had that?
Ever had a dream of, say it one more time?
Have you ever had a dream of the future of your kids, your children, will follow your journey with art, or do you think that they're going to go a different path with art?
I wish they
You
would.
think it'll be the same?
I wish my kids would.
Okay, sure.
If I go left, they go right.
So you're an Atlanta native, but you've been to Knoxville a couple of times at this point. What's been your favorite part of visiting Knoxville or the Knoxville Museum of Art?
I like to travel, and then, I think, I don't know, I look at the whole Southeast and the South. I look at it as like one state in some strange way. And I've always been influenced. I think when I was first starting as, quote, practicing artist, the area that embraced me first was North Carolina. And then after North Carolina, there was Texas. And then there was New Orleans. And so I've always felt like within this area, it's always been like grounds, fertile grounds for me as an artist. And it still feels like fertile grounds and important grounds. Often, like I was mentioned earlier, we move away. A lot of times we as artists, we will move away to get as close as we can to New York and all these art hubs. But I think the more and more we come back and we stay within those areas, we're able to make it a lot better or a lot more interesting. And I find that a beautiful thing. I find that it's, how many hours are we away from Georgia, Atlanta? What, 2, 3? And it feels like, yeah, it's not far at all. It's around the corner. And so I think that's interesting. And then being able to come to museums and travel throughout these areas, we have enough around each other that makes it even more interesting, And I've always felt like I've gotten support throughout the Southeast because of that. And be it Birmingham, Alabama, be it, I'd even call Florida a major part. And it's just always been important to be able to connect within this region. Because it holds so much information that influences our work. So, I don't know. Yeah, so yes, it's had a big influence on me. Really cool.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate Radcliffe Bailey sharing his heart and stories with us tonight. And I really appreciate everyone coming out. Thank you. Have a good evening.